we've been kind of building up this evidence for the global flood of Noah. And last time we talked about the geology, so deep sediment layers that are across continents and covering almost entire continents, fine layers of sediment that stack up rapidly, where evolutionists would say that normally takes millions of years, sediment that's transported long distance across the United States, rapid coal formation, rapid canyon formation. We talked about volcanoes. So today we're going to continue kind of building this evidence for the flood by talking about the fossils that we find. And how long does it take to make a fossil, and what do they say about the age of the Earth? So hang on to your seats here because we're going to dig up the facts on fossils tonight. Everybody ready? All right. So since we're talking about fossils, and fossils are found in rocks, we probably need to know a little bit about how rocks are formed. And some of this will be a little repetitive, but you know, a little repetition helps sink that in your mind. At least it does for me. So the assumption that it takes millions of years to make rock. But nobody was there to observe it, so do we really know how long it took to make that rock? There are three types of rock, if you remember. There's igneous rock, which is molten material. It's directly from the volcano and the magma. It crystallizes and it forms rock. No fossils in igneous rock. Sedimentary rocks are rocks that are made from waterborne, water-deposited sediments stacked in layers, and then the pressure squeezes the water out and the heat bakes them into that rock. And then the metamorphic rocks are sedimentary rocks that are changed, they're metamorphized into a different rock. The heat and all the pressure changes it. So we find very few fossils in metamorphic rocks. It's not unheard of, but very few because the heat and the pressure ultimately changes the rock. So where are fossils found then? Sedimentary rocks. Most of the rocks are sedimentary rocks. And we find those in limestone, which is made out of lime and calcite, shale, which is mud, silt, and clays, and sandstone, which is sand particles cemented together. So what are the required elements to make rock?
Sediment, water.
Sediment?
Water and water.
And something is cemented together, right? And that can be rock cement. A lot of times it's calcium carbonate or lime or silicon dioxide. So those are the basic components of making rocks. Is that a rock?
Yes.
Yeah, I can actually say that I have seen rock harden. Right? And you all have too. And if you think about this, a lot of people think, oh, well, that's not natural. Well, actually, if you look at the Romans, they were like some of the first ones to invent concrete, and they took lime and ash from Mount Vesuvius, and that sets up underwater. That's called hydraulic cement. And that's better than the concrete that we make today. In fact, our scientists are going out to look at these Roman structures to try to figure out how they made concrete that withstands marine environments. And those are natural. And so we can all actually say, yes, that was around when rock formed. So not what the evolutionists anticipate, but this is rock. Time is really of no consequence then. And here's an example. This natural gas pipeline, this whole plant closed down after 3 months of operation because this natural gas pipe was filled with rock. So under the right conditions, rock can form very rapidly. Under the wrong conditions, not even millions of years will form rock. And we talked about this a little bit last time, but I just kind of wanted to give a little more background here. This is sedimentary rock, right? Coal is a sedimentary rock. And most people think that that's millions of years of slow formation of peat and vegetation in this swamp, and that 10 feet of coal, 10 feet of peat are required to make 1 foot of coal. But the evolutionary myth is that it takes time, millions of years, pressure to squeeze out all the water and compact the material, and then a lot of heat to bake it all together. Now, it's interesting because there are many plants that are found in coal that don't like to grow in swamps. So that should be a first clue that it's not always just material in swamps. And there are actually swamps today that are not actively producing coal. So a lot of myths about coal formation. Again, showed this last time, but we have several layers of coal here. Some of them are inches thick, some of them are feet thick, but they're all separated by these clay bands. And you notice that they're nice, smooth surfaces on these coal beds. And again, if trees grew in here over millions of years, you should see some sort of a root action or a root ball down there. But we don't. So does it make more sense that the plant and the tree, all the vegetation was already dead because it was ripped up during the flood and it was deposited here in low depression areas, then more sediment piled on top of it, squeezed out the water, and it forms these nice flat surfaces? That seems to make more sense to me. Otherwise we'd see more root balls if the things actually grew right there. Vegetation won't form into coal unless it's buried. We know that. We don't see trees turning into coal laying on top of the ground. So everybody agrees that coal forms when plant material is buried. Now, you see these coal deposits everywhere across the United States, other countries as well. But we have these from Pennsylvania down into Mississippi and Alabama, Illinois and Ohio, Kentucky, across the Midwest here, the Southwest, and up here in the Dakotas, and even in Alaska and Texas. That would have taken massive amounts of sediment to bury a lot of vegetation. But yet we see these, again, across countries. So now switching over to fossils, the same conditions that are required to make rock are the same conditions that it takes to make a fossil. So let's see what this is. Incidentally, I brought some of my fossil collection up here, and in case you don't want to stand in line and pay the admission price for this museum, I put a couple of pictures up here. Now, seriously, you can come after the presentation and take a look at these, but here's just a couple. This is a shrimp from the Cretaceous period that's supposedly 80 million years old. Can everybody say, ooh? Right. So this was found in Lebanon. Here's a herring-like fish that was found in the Eocene epoch in the Green River Formation, supposedly 50 million years ago. Can everybody say, ah? Ah. Yeah, I don't believe they're that old, and neither should you. So fossils form when vegetation or animals are trapped and they're buried with a truckload of sediment, waterborne sediment. And then the same ingredients that form rock, right? Clay, sands, or silts, water that's already there, and then a lot of the minerals that then seep into this creature to replace the soft parts and the body cavities with minerals that solidify in a rock instead of the flesh material, and that's how we get a fossil. Pretty easy said and done, right? So, actually there's a lot of evidence out there that supports rapid sedimentation and burial, because a lot of evolutionists will say, well, it takes millions of years of slow, gradual deposition of sediment over the top of a dead animal to form a fossil. There's a lot of evidence, and we're going to look at rapid deposition and rapid burial of animal life. And the ideal conditions for fossils and forming all the fossil layers are flood conditions, right? And that's why we get billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. It's exactly what we would expect. But rapid burial and fossilization is contrary to what the evolutionists would say. So, again, we've got these two dilemmas of which one do we believe. So, we'll use some of the same reasoning that they do, see what makes sense, and we'll also look at some actual observational data that would support the biblical theory instead of the evolutionary theory. And really, we have the same fossils, right? It's just a matter of how we interpret the evidence versus how the evolutionist interprets the evidence. We've said that over and over again. But if the conditions are correct, if there's enough mineral in the groundwater or the lake or whatever, we can actually fossilize bone within a couple of weeks. We can also create petrified wood in a lab in less than a week. So fossils, under the right conditions, as I said, can form very quickly. Now, the Genesis flood, creationists believe, was an event that created the ideal situations for fossilization. A lot of water, a lot of the minerals. Where do we get our minerals? There's some in the water, but we have a lot of minerals in the earth. And so what happened during the flood? It ripped up all those minerals, dumped them in the water. And there's plenty of sediment to bury things and those minerals to seep in to replace body parts, soft body parts, and become a fossil. Now again, this is the evolutionist geologic column. And it's supposed to be this record of time in which all these animals lived. But there's problems interpreting this because they would like you to believe that this geologic column exists out in nature. But as I said last time, this doesn't exist anywhere in its entirety in the real world. It's only in the textbooks. So they take rock layers from this part of the country and they superimpose them on rock layers in this part of the country, and that's how they get this geologic column. The other thing they'd like you to believe is that you can tell the age of rocks by the fossils that are contained in them. This is supposed to be, again, evidence in this rock layer when trilobites and crinoids, those type of animals lived at that epoch of time. And so they'll look at these and they'll say, well, yeah, if you have a rock and you bring it to me and it's got a fossil in it, and that's supposed to be 250 million year old, based on nothing but their thought of when that critter evolved and the time it would have taken to evolve to the next animal form in the rock layers above it. So that's just their philosophy on how many years that would have taken. But they'll take that data, they'll take that perceived, or that we'll call it made up date, and they'll apply it to the rock layer. And so then they'll apply that date to another rock layer and say, well, yeah, that fossil that's not called an index fossil that we don't find just kind of across all strata, then they'll date that by using the rocks. So again, the paleontologists use the fossils to date the rocks, and then the paleontologists will look at the rock age to date the fossils. Again, a lot of circular reasoning going on here. And they would like you to believe that this sorting is just exactly like this says. Nice, neat. In this layer, you see nothing but these animals. In the next layer, nothing but these animals. Now, I would say that there are marine animals in all of these layers. And in fact, these are some fossilized ammonites. I happen to have an ammonite up here in our fossil collection. And these ammonites are found in the Himalayan mountains. So it tells you something about water depth. Not that it got 29,000 feet, but at one point in time they were underwater and then they raised up at the end of the flood. We also see whale fossils in mountains in South America, and marine fossils in the Grand Canyon walls at 8,000 feet above sea level. So we find marine fossils throughout the geologic column, and isn't that what you would expect from a global flood? It would be for me. Now there's some interesting skeletons that have been found. This happens to have been in Japan. It was discovered in 2013 and they've been excavating ever since. This is a picture of what it looked like in 2017, but it's a hadrosaurid marine, or a hadrosaurid dinosaur in marine fossil layers. Now this doesn't happen very often where you actually find a dinosaur in lower strata than it's supposed to be. But these are dinosaurs, they've got 3 examples of this, and they're in the lower strata with marine creatures. how does that happen unless they live together? Because if these are supposed to be, nicely sorted over millions of years, then you can't have this hadrosaur fossil in marine structure, marine strata, unless they live together. Does that make sense to everybody? This is the creationist view. The geologic column is not an indication where animals lived and when they lived. It's a record of where they died, and that's based on how they were able to escape the rising floodwaters based on their own mobility. I've mentioned that before, but this makes more sense from an observational standpoint as well, observation science. 95% of all the fossils that we have are marine invertebrates. Invertebrates are animals that do not have a backbone. 95% of our fossils are those types of critters. The remaining 5%, 95% of those, or 4.7%, are algae and plants. A very small portion, 0.2%, are insects and other invertebrates, not marine invertebrates. 0.1% are vertebrate animals, animals that have a backbone, including dinosaurs. And out of that, a very small fraction are what we would consider primate fossils, or apes, chimpanzees, and we'll put them all in a category of what evolutionists would call hominids, that they would even include man. So why do you think this number is so small? Yeah.
Because they could walk and get to higher ground where instead of being buried, they would just rot in the sun.
They could escape those waters, and they would probably drown in the flood more so than being buried by sediment layers. Very good. So we'll drill down into that a little bit deeper here. Here's the evolutionist view of fossilization, right? An animal dies or plant, sinks down to the bottom, and then lays there, decomposes, and then over millions and millions and countless millions of years, it forms a fossil. When's the last time you saw, driving down the road and you see a dead animal on the side of the road? You come back later and all of a sudden it's a fossil, right? Is it even there? A lot of times it's not even there. Sometimes you'll just watch it disintegrate over time, but most of the time it's going to be scavenged, and next time you go around it's not even going to be there. So a lot of problems with a slow fossil in deposition. Incidentally, if this is all about uniformitarian theory and things have always been the same way, do we see fossils forming today? I don't. Now, evolutionists will say, well, it's because it's over millions and millions of years. But again, it takes conditions, ideal conditions, to rapidly bury something before it'll even think about becoming a fossil. Problems with slow fossilization. Again, the material, whatever the body parts or the plant material would rot before it would form a fossil. So, who has fish? When a fish dies, what happens to it? It doesn't sink to the bottom. It bloats and rots and it floats to the top. And that's what we would see. And so then you would either have scavengers, or UV rays from the sun can even disintegrate wood over time. And so over time then, these body parts would be scattered, probably never even make a fossil. And so that's why, going back to Adam's answer here, that's why we don't see a lot of human fossils or vertebrate fossils. Because if they could escape to higher ground, they would have been swept off, they would have been swimming, drowned, and most likely they would have bloated and floated on the top until the waves and the rubble that was in the water pulverized them, the sun came out and rotted them, and they sank to the bottom and didn't leave a trace. Now we do have some that were succumbed by sediments, and that's why we find some, but that's why that that 1/10 of 1% is all we see of vertebrate fossils. Now let's look at some examples of modern day fossils that kind of defy the millions of years. Here's a fossilized hard hat. It was actually a felt hat from a miner in a Spray silver mine, and is now in the Central Tasmania Museum, but the miner dropped it into limey water and left it there, and now it's a hard hat. Kind of defies the millions of years that it takes to make a fossil, right? I showed this picture before. This is a ship bell from Isabella Watson that sank in 1852 off the coast of Victoria, Australia, and a lot of rock encrusted in that ship bell. That didn't take millions of years, obviously. This is an interesting one. In England, there's a petrifying well, and they suspend teddy bears in this fountain, or this waterfall that's got a lot of minerals in it. And this has been a tourist attraction since 1630. And in this fall, there's a lot of calcium carbonate, and they permineralize these bears, these teddy bears, in 3 months' time. And they sell them in the gift shop. They're hard rock teddy bears. Again, doesn't take millions of years to even turn something soft and cuddly into rock. This is ordinary fencing wire that was found in Western Australia, and hard to see in this picture, but there are seashells here. But when they cut this open, both longitudinally and cross section, you can see the individual strands of wire all encased in rock. This is also a petrified water wheel in Australia, and the minerals in the water were so dense that as the water came down and turned the water wheel, this water wheel was encased in rock in less than 65 years. And these are spark plugs from, generally they think, a marine engine, a boat, that was found off of Ventura, California, found in 1988 or 98, and they said it couldn't date for much more than 1950. So a lot of these things aren't old. They fossilize in rock very rapidly. These are bags of flour in a mill in Arkansas that closed in 1903. There was a river that saturated these bags, and that water emanated from a limestone rock ledge, so it carried a lot of lime with it. And these bags petrified, and you can even see these flour sack stitching at the end of the bag. Solid rock now. So you might ask, well, what about the millions of years that evolutionists tell us these fossils are? How do we debate that? Well, there are obviously many problems with these old ages, and some of them, obviously we can't date fossils unless there's some carbon left in it. All living matter has carbon in it. You can't date a rock using carbon-14. As I mentioned before, you can't date sedimentary rocks directly, because the sediment particles come from all over. And so you get a lot of discordant ages if you try to date them with radioactive isotope dating that we use for rocks. So you can't date rocks or sedimentary rocks unless you use the index fossils, which we already know are in error. And second, the process doesn't take long, nor it's almost impossible for it to take long periods of time, based on that slow deposition and burial. So let's take a look at some examples here. This guy in the orange shirt, his name is Bob Harmon. He's a paleontologist, and in 2000, he was in Bozeman, Montana, and he happened to look up during his lunch break. He was looking for fossils, happened to look up, and there was this T-Rex femur, leg bone, sticking out of this cliff near Bozeman, Montana. They actually named it B-Rex, because it was a Tyrannosaurus Rex. They actually named it B-Rex after him. This gal's name is Mary Schweitzer. She's also a paleontologist, and she helped analyze the fossils. She took them back to the lab, cut a piece of the bone in half and looked at it underneath a microscope, and this is what she found. Elastic tissue that was still stretchy, collagen that's found in bones, you and I have it, this fiber structure on bone, and then this is a blow up, a microscopic blow up of a vein, and all these little dots are red blood cells. Now, this is great evidence for a biblical timeline. We know that DNA and blood cells just can't last more than a few tens of thousands of years, and that's probably on the conservative side. So that defies the 65 million year age that they would assign a T-Rex when the T-Rex is dying. Now it's interesting because when you bring this to their attention, they know that DNA doesn't last for tens of thousands of years. What do you think their response was? Well, I guess DNA can last for 65 million years. Right? Instead of questioning their own belief system, they adapted actual science to their belief system. It's pretty incredible. In fact, one of the bones that they found was found in a very porous sandstone layer. Sandstone will allow water to permeate very rapidly. So if there's any minerals going through the sandstone, it should have been in the bones, but these bones, even the paleontologists said, the bones look fresh. So that should tell you that they're not millions of years. Here's another example. This is a mine in Australia. In 1994, they drilled an exhaust shaft, and 69 feet down in this basalt layer, they found wood. And that wood was in, ordinary wood, charred wood, and ash. And they took the wood to a laboratory and they tested it using carbon-14 because trees were once living creatures, right? Or once living things. And so they're made of carbon. So you can use carbon-14 to date them. They dated the wood and it was 45,000 years old. They dated the rock at 45 million years. How do you get 45,000-year-old wood and 45 million-year-old basalt? If it were the opposite, right, where something old was surrounded by something young, but here we have just the opposite. Something young is supposedly surrounded by something old. So it tells you that, now, do I believe these years, 45,000 years old? No, something's wrong with the dating methods. And when we come back and look at radioactive dating and carbon dating, I'll show you a lot of errors, a lot of assumptions that are made that lead to these erroneous dates. Now, if the Genesis flood actually happened, there should be indicators, there should be evidence of rapid fossil burial, right? Let's take a look at some of what we actually find. Here's a fish eating a fish, minding its own business, going through its normal daily activities when rapidly buried. Here's the fish in the mouth. This is an ichthyosaur. An ichthyosaur was a porpoise-like or a dolphin-like, about 6 foot long. And here, you can see it's giving birth to one of its babies. The beak is still in the birth canal. So one moment, normal daily giving birth, and the next moment in time, snap frozen in time because it was rapidly buried. Not over millions of years. This would have never happened. Slow sedimentation over millions and millions of years. Here's another ichthyosaur. You can see over here, that's one of the babies. There's another one still in the womb here. Here's a close-up. You see the vertebrae, and you see the beak. So this is real life happening when something got buried rapidly. This is an interesting one. These are two fossils. This is a fossil of what they call Rhamphorhynchus. It's like a pterodactyl or a pterosaur, or some sort of flying dinosaur. and this one is called Aspitorhynchus. And if you look at this area, you can see, and actually what the scientists believe happened is the pterodactyl or the Rhamphorhynchus was swooping down over the water to get its last meal, and it was speared by the Aspitorhynchus. And here's a close-up. You can see clearly the throat is in the mouth of this Aspitorhynchus. And it's hard to see from this, but this is kind of an X-ray picture. There's an undigested fish in the esophagus of the Rhamphorhynchus. Again, things happen quickly when you're buried rapidly with sediment. This is the famous fish inside a fish that was found in Hays, Kansas, and now it's in the Sternberg Museum. But you can see the fish hadn't been digested yet. And here's another fish eating a fish. So again, we see lots of rapid burial evidence. And we even see mass fossilized graveyards. Right? These are large graveyards that have multiple bones in them from animals, which is interestingly enough, a lot of the animals don't even live in the same ecosystem. They live apart from each other, but yet they're buried together. That seems odd to be buried over millions and millions of years if they normally don't live in the same place, sand grain by sand grain at a time. But if they were all drowned in the flood and mixed up in the flood and then dumped into a low-lying area and then sediment packed on top of it, it makes sense that these things died in the same location even though they didn't live in the same location. And a lot of these bones, they're just an arm or a leg, generally not full fossils, although there are some full fossils that we find in these mass graveyards. But all these bones are jumbled up, what you would expect if they were mixed up in a worldwide flood. We also see schools of fish that are fossilized. And you can see that they're all generally swimming in the same direction. Here's another example, all swimming in the same direction. To me, these are animals that are trying to flee from sediment or something coming at them, right? This just isn't right. Now we know fish swim in schools, and some fish, they chase each other around. But we see these in mass layers every place, which gives you the indication that this, my feeling is, and many creation scientists, that these fish are fleeing something. And here are some fossilized dinosaur eggs. And if you zoom in close enough here, this is an insert set here. These show the embryos in the eggs. Now, if this were millions of years of slow sedimentation and slow burial and slow fossilization, surely those eggs would have been scavenged by predators, or those things that like to eat the eggs of other animals. This wouldn't have taken millions of years. This is, again, rapid burial. And then we have many fossils that look exactly like they do today. Here's a shrimp, jellyfish, the horseshoe crab, and the Dickinsonia. All of these look very similar to what we have today. How did they go through millions and millions of years of evolution if they were supposed to have, all these beneficial mutations so that they could evolve into the next layer? But these remain virtually unchanged. Now, I would say that each one of these, that it was designed to do what it does do. What it does do well. Doesn't it? Yes, it does. I think it does. Do you? I do. Hope you do too. Do you? So, these are all the same critters that we have today. And, incidentally, evolutionists will call these living fossils. Crocodiles are also living fossils. There are a lot of them. There's the Walmini pine is supposed to be a living fossil or living dinosaur because they've remained unchanged, virtually unchanged, over countless millions and millions of years. We also have soft tissues that are fossilized. This happens to be a jellyfish. Now, how many people have been to the beach and have seen a jellyfish wash up on shore? Many. How long did it last? When I was a kid, I saw these on the beach in California, and within a couple hours, it was disintegrating. So would it just lay there and over millions of years form a fossil? No, it had to be buried rapidly again. And we see these, not just onesies and twosies, we see these, massive burial grounds of these jellyfish. So this didn't happen once upon a time on the beach, but massive layers of sediment that buried these. Here's an interesting one. These are two dinosaurs that are fighting to the death, and they were fossilized. These were discovered in Mongolia Gobi Desert in 1971. Now, it's a little difficult to see because there's still a lot of sediment here, so this is a model that has been put together that kind of is a scale model. This is the Protoceratops. It's got the headgear here, and the Velociraptor. And note, the Velociraptor has got his arm in the mouth of the Protoceratops. The other one is wrapped around the headgear, and this foot is firmly lodged in the rib cage of the Protoceratops. Now, do you think that in the heat of the battle, these two guys said, "Oh, hold that pose. That's going to be great in a million years"? No, they were rapidly buried. They didn't even see this coming, right? So may have been a skirmish as they were trying to get away from something, rising floodwaters. But again, this wasn't posed over millions of years. This was rapid. And we see dinosaur footprints as well. There are many examples of these dinosaur footprints, and they've been preserved. Now, how many people have been walking in your backyard in mud and left footprints? Yeah. Did you find the fossils of your footprints? Not yet. We're just not old enough, are we? I can't even go out there and find my footprints that I put in mud after this last downpour rain that we had. They're gone. So it's interesting also that we find these footprint examples. They're also traveling, a lot of them, in the same direction. And in fact, this is a cement plant in Bolivia, Peru. It's called Cal Orco. When they were excavating material to enlarge the cement plant, they found this rock ledge that was tilted up, and these are fossilized trackways, fossilized footprints of many dinosaurs. And this is one of the largest concentration of dinosaur trackways in the world. It's about 4,000 feet long, almost 300 foot high, has more than 5,000 footprints of 460 individual trails. Now, the evolutionist viewpoint of this is that this was once a nice placid lake where dinosaurs would come to the watering hole, and then in periods where it was wet, they would sink in, leave their footprints, then it would dry out, these footprints would become, hard, and then during the next wet period, more sediment would be, silted in, and that would make these fossilized footprints. I find that hard to believe. Now, I do, when this whole rock bed was lifted up, I believe that happened during the flood when the fountains of the Great Deep broke open. But let's look at this. Do these look like trackways of animals that are just kind of meandering around the lake? Again, most of these, this is just a sampling, but most of these are going roughly in the same direction. Creation scientists would say that this is because they're fleeing from the rising floodwaters, trying to get away as fast as they can. So many times in the fossil record, what we find are the footprints of the fossil in lower sediment layers, And then above those footprints, we find the fossils of the bones or the animal remains that are supposedly separated by millions and millions of years according to evolutionary time frames. So think about that. The footprints, if you're on an evolutionary time scale, the footprints would have occurred before the animal even existed. But we find those. So how did the animal leave its footprints in the lower sediment layers unless, again, it was escaping these floodwaters, left the footprints in the soft material, and finally succumbed and got buried to the waves, in the upper layers. Again, not millions of years. These are some of my favorites, though. These are called polystrate fossils. Polystrate comes from two words, poly, like polygon, it has many sides, and strate, or strata, layers. Think of strata as different sediment layers. So these are fossils that span many layers. Does that make sense? This is a polystrate fossil of a pine tree, and this is supposed to be millions of years of time. All of these layers being laid down very slowly and very gradually over millions of years of time. What happens when you have a tree and then over millions and millions of years it's being buried? It decays. You wouldn't even see the top, right? It should have sheared off long ago. Also something interesting. If you look at these, there are, again, no root balls, no root structures that have been fossilized in either picture. This is the better picture of one, but do you see any roots here? Not even a root ball. And many of these, this one actually does look like there's some bark on it, but many of these don't have bark on these trees. So remember that little tidbit. That's a thought that will come back later. So again, I would call this evidence of millions of years of slow and gradual burial because these span millions of years of rock layers. Now, I would call this polyproblematic. Many problems on many layers, if you will. Now, we find fossils, and sometimes we find fossilized pine trees in coal layers. Coal, remember, is supposed to be made out of all this plant material that's grown in swamp or peat bogs. We have a problem. One of the problems is pine trees don't like swamps. Pine trees can't deal with having their roots in water, buried, covered with water for more than a couple of days at a time. So how do pine trees grow in coal? It's a good question. Also, we mentioned there are no roots, no fossilized roots. The fossils, many of these polystrate fossils lack bark. And how can they exist in layers that are supposed to span millions of years of time? And a lot of times we find that the tree is dated younger than the rocks above and below it. It's hard to justify all that from an evolutionary standpoint. Now, here's a more likely scenario. And I'll lay this out, and then you can tell me if this makes sense. At the beginning of the flood, the first waves came in, ripped the trees out from the land that they were growing on, sheared a lot of them off at the root ball. They floated horizontally in the water. They formed these massive log mats. And we were talking about massive numbers of trees in forests. So they formed these log mats. These log mats floated around, rubbing the bark off of the trees. The roots do their job, right? They're supposed to soak up water. So whatever is left of the root ball here that didn't get sheared off is soaking up water. That root ball becomes heavier because it's saturated with water. So they start floating upright. And as they take up more water, they become waterlogged, and the weight is now greater than the upward force of the buoyancy in the water, and so they begin to settle. What's also settling is all the sediment particles that are floating in suspension. Remember our jar of dirt that we put water in and shook it up, and then all that sediment settles out, these nice flat layers here? So if these sediment layers were depositing, at the same time these trees were sinking at different rates, different times, it would appear, would it not, that you have trees that started growing in different sediment layers, and now they are spanning multiple layers of sediment. And actually from a creationist standpoint, this happens very quickly. But if I were an evolutionist, and I would come back thousands of years later and I would say, well gosh, this looks like multiple forests that had grown separated by millions and millions of years. Who's been to Yellowstone National Park? Was anybody brave enough to take the hike up to look at the petrified forest? I was, and I saw one that was just kind of by itself, but if you go up on it's a pretty aggressive hike, you can see these petrified trees standing vertically. And the evolutionists will tell you, well, they grew over countless millions of years, different forests, one layer on top of another. Does this make a little more sense, this flood model? Now you might say, this is pie in the sky stuff, what evidence do we have? And remember,
Nothing.
pardon?
Mount St. Helens. The same thing happened in the Lake City.
Same thing happened in Mount St. Helens, exactly right. Let's look at this. May 18th, 1980, Mount St. Helens blew up, triggered by an earthquake, 5.1 magnitude on the Richter scale. The eruption blew out the whole north face with the pyroclastic blast. All the trees in the forest were swept out, snapped like toothpicks, and they were deposited in Spirit Lake. Tree mats floating together, rubbing bark off trees. Incidentally, that bark had settled to the bottom of the lake and has formed a 3-foot layer of peat very rapidly. These log mats floated from shore to shore, blown by the wind, rubbing everything, all the bark off. A few months later, they drained a portion of the lake. And what they found were more than 15,000 upright logs settling out with the root ball at the bottom, which appeared to be in multiple different layers of sediment. 1,000 years from now, if that lake ever dries out, there are people going to say, oh, this is forest, several layers of forest that grew over countless millions of years. Observational science is what we're looking at here. We can see this. It's been duplicated in a perfect lab environment. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better classroom environment for creationists than what Mount St. Helens is. We saw the rapid canyon formation examples. We see these petrified trees, and I would say that these trees probably aren't going to take long to petrify. Remember, there was the Basilica in Rome that was built in the water. It was built on over 150,000 wood columns that are now rock columns. They petrified. I would expect to see something similar happen to this, but this is, again, a classroom environment. So polystrate fossils are not really a mystery if you look at it from a creationist worldview. Now here's one of my favorites. This is what they call the kamikaze ichthyosaur. They found the head and a few vertebrae up above the head in the neck region, and they found that spanning 3 layers of sediment that supposedly represent 1 million years of time in an evolutionary time frame. Now, from a creationist standpoint, I would say, well, that was buried during the flood, and he just happened to be vertical when the sediment buried him. Here's the evolutionary argument here, their explanation. Creature dies, instead of bloating and floating, he dives to the bottom head first. His lungs are out of air now, and so he's not as buoyant. He picks up steam, hits the bottom at such a velocity that he penetrates 3 different layers of soil. And then the top of him continued to rot away until it was swept away. Adam?
If he went that fast under the ground, wouldn't you see damage to the nose or beak, whatever you would call that thing?
Absolutely. If he's hitting that velocity to penetrate, and think about this, if these layers formed over millions of years, you think that material would be hard or soft? It'd be rock. That would be a beak that looked like an accordion. Right? So, does the evolutionary explanation make sense? And that's what I'm trying to get the point across here, that when you use the truth of God's Word and what we know from Scripture, things that we see in nature make sense because we're looking at it through this mesh of Scripture. The only source that we know is true. And it does make sense when you look at it that way. So here's our dilemma, right? We've all got the same facts, but we bring our own presuppositional biases into looking at the facts. So we can either look at it from a biblical viewpoint or man's secular viewpoint. The evolutionists will look at the fossil record and they'll say, oh, well, see, millions of years over time, death, disease, suffering, and, we can make sense out of fossils because of slow, gradual sedimentation and burial. All these nice little index fossils lived at this certain time. Makes sense to them, even though they have to buy into a lot of pretty hokey explanations, right? Or we have the biblical viewpoint that says, hey, we have something called the biblical flood of Noah's day. That seems to make more sense when we look at all the different fossil layers that we have. Not only geology, but also the fossils. And 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 5 to 7 says, but they deliberately forgot that long ago by God's word, the heavens existed and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. By the same word, the present heavens and the earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the final day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. So why is it important that we know this information? Not only for our children's sake, so that they're equipped to go in the world, but that we can share our apologia, our apologetics, our answers, so that we can save these people from the final day of judgment. That's really what it's all about. It's this two-forked attack. Give our youth and equip them with a solid foundation on biblical truth, but also to save the world. Or to bring the information, I should say, so Christ can save them. That's really what it's all about. So we can make these deductions from the Bible. It describes a worldwide flood. There was water that was redeposited sediments everywhere all across the earth. Billions of plants and animals were rapidly buried. Fossils formed rather quickly under the right conditions. Most fossils would have been formed then during the flood. Most of what we see in the fossil layers was during the flood. Now, are there some fossils that may have formed post-flood by other small floods? Yes, but very small numbers. Most of what we see are fossils that were buried during the flood. And then again, those animal remains are located in the fossil record based on their ability to escape the flood waters as they arose. And many of them didn't get buried. They floated, they rotted, they sank to the bottom or disintegrated or were scavenged. That's what makes more sense And so the real battle, again, is not over who has the best evidence. The real battle is who decides truth. Does fallible man decide truth and say, oh yeah, this is all millions of years? Or does our infallible God define truth, and we see that in the global flood? And I would think that if you would look at observational evidence, observational science, you'd have to admit that observational science confirms what the Bible says and does not confirm the millions of years. So again, when we look at the world around us, we have to put on our biblical glasses, or biblical reality glasses, and we have to think, does what I read here match what I see in the real world? If it doesn't, we don't reinterpret this, we interpret how we perceive the evidence around us. This never changes. Men's textbooks change all the time. Bibles never changed. So we have to put on our biblical reality glasses no matter what we do, because that's the truth, and that's the only thing we have to hang on to. Food tanks. And so if the print was made, as long as it wasn't, sloshy mud, like, we've stepped in mud, you pull your shoe out or your foot out, your shoe stays in the mud, instead of being pulled out.
Kind of more like a clay.
Yeah, as long as it was wet clay, not just soup, then the next sediment, or the next wave of sediments comes in and fills that up, and then it's able to preserve those. But that is a good question, and they have experimented with that in the laboratory in these flumes. Again, using observational science to see if this theory really holds, and it does. Adam?
So you're saying how when things die blows up, they blow and they float to the surface. Does that mean most of the fossils that we see were buried alive?
Yes. Let me rephrase it. We don't know if they were buried alive. We certainly saw the dinosaurs fighting. They were buried alive. We saw the fish eating fish. They were buried alive. So I would say yes, most were, but something could still drown and be swept up onto the land, before it was bloated and floated to the top. So that certainly is a possibility, but I think most was rapidly buried while they were still alive. Anybody else?
Well, I just find it unbelievable that, like, even the footprints, how can these extremely smart educators see that and not have any sort of question? I mean, it's more a statement than a question, but
Yeah.
just, but even from any scientific perspective, whether you're a believer or not, that is just pure decision already. I'm not going to see anything else other than this. And even me as a believer, I try to see things through just a lens of what everyone would see, and there's no way I could come to a conclusion that there's not a God. I've tried.
And that's the crux of the matter, right? You either want to believe this or you don't want to believe this. And that's the big difference, right? And that's why there are some people who, when you see the evidence, like the soft tissue, it can really last 70 million years. It's because they don't want to believe this. Because if they do, that means there is a God, and that means they're accountable to Him, and He owns them. And they have to change their life. And that's the crux of the matter. And that's why it's so important for us. Again, that verse in 2 Peter, it's important for us to know the facts, because to you and I it's obvious. I think if you would point the kamikaze ichthyosaur out and say, really, how logical is this? I think they'd have to say, yeah, your method sounds like it's probably a little more believable, but people will buy into anything because they don't want to believe this. That's the crux of the matter. But if we can give them enough evidence to again, shoot the holes in their foundation, that's what it's going to take. That's why we're trying to equip all of you people to go out and to make a difference in the world, and not only in our young men and women's lives either, because they're going to go to colleges and they're going to be ridiculed because they believe in this book. And you need to have answers. And you need to be able to stand on the firm foundation. These answers make sense and these are true because this is the only true history book that we have. Anybody else? Incidentally, I did want to say in this article, it talked about, I can find this again, it talks about this huge cloud that came up and blocked out all the light. We're going to talk about that ash cloud next week when we talk about the Ice Age. And so again, it dovetails perfectly with this article and what we would expect when we talk about melting the mystery of the Ice Age. Did it really happen? Was there one? Were there multiple thousands over millions and millions of years? We're going to dig down and solve the mystery of the Ice Age. Let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, again, we're so grateful for the number of people that you have brought tonight just to hear the truth of your word and how it makes sense with what we see around us in this world that you gave us. Even though we consider this, Lord, a beautiful environment that you've placed us in, it's still a broken world that shows the scars of your judgment. But Lord, thank you for the evidence that we have to know not only just intuitively that your word is true, and that's really all we need, Lord. We just know that we can trust you. But how blessed we are to have this laboratory around us that you've given us, Lord, to be able to see the evidence for what you say in your word. Father, I pray that you would equip us to go out and to have that secure knowledge, that secure foundation that we can share with other people to bring them to a full understanding of you and your Son. Jesus, we ask this all in your name. Amen. If you'd like to come up and look at some fossils, feel free. Thank you all for coming tonight.